My name is Naomi Ostrander. I'm 42 years old and I work as a forensic accountant, which means I spend most of my professional life doing exactly one thing, following money until it tells the truth, no matter how long that takes or how carefully someone has tried to make it look like nothing is missing. On the evening of April 19th this year, standing in the newly renovated back room of Astor and Vine's flagship store in Savannah, Georgia, wearing a navy dress I'd bought specifically for the occasion, I watched my mother and my younger sister prepare to ask me in front of 41 guests to sign away the last third of what my father had spent 31 years building. I want to start there at that exact moment because I think it's the only honest place to begin. My father, Walter Ostrander, founded Astor and Vine in 1994 as a single home goods shop on Bull Street, the kind of store that sold hand-thrown pottery and linen table runners to people who wanted their homes to feel considered rather than decorated. By the time he died 5 years ago, it had grown into 3 locations across coastal Georgia, a modest but genuinely profitable business, and a family trust holding just over $1.2 million in combined assets. Inventory, property, and a reserve account meant, according to the will he left behind, to be split evenly among the 3 people he trusted most in the world: my mother Vivian, my younger sister Camille, and me. That night, the occasion was Astor and Vine's 25th anniversary, technically the 25th since the first store opened, though my father had only lived to see 20 of those years himself. My mother had organized what she called a legacy celebration, complete with a hired string quartet, a slideshow of my father's original hand-drawn shop layouts projected onto the exposed brick wall, and a guest list that included 2 local business journalists, several of the store's longtime vendors, and a man named Aldous Whitfield, whom I'd learned only 3 weeks earlier was a private equity buyer my mother and sister had been quietly courting since January, with an offer on the table to purchase full ownership of Astor and Vine for $2.4 million. I want to be precise about what happened in that back room because precision has been the one constant of my entire adult life, and it's the reason none of what came next would have been possible without it. My mother pulled me aside at 7:40 p.m., 40 minutes before the toast she'd planned for the main room, and told me, with Camille standing just behind her shoulder in a dress the exact shade of the flagship store's signature sage green paint, that she and Camille had decided the cleanest path forward for the family was for me to sign a document relinquishing my trustee status and my 1/3 ownership stake, in exchange for what she called a fair buyout of $180,000, roughly 45% of what an even split of the actual $2.4 million sale would have entitled me to. We were standing in the back storage room, the same room I realized only after the fact, where my father had collapsed 5 years earlier, surrounded by boxes of anniversary programs and unopened cases of champagne. I remember noticing the smell first, cardboard and cold air conditioning, and faintly my mother's perfume, the same one she'd worn to his funeral. Camille held a small leather folio against her chest, the kind you'd carry documents in, and I understood looking at it that they'd printed the buyout agreement in advance, expecting a signature that night, expecting the specific kind of quiet, accommodating agreement I had given them in one form or another for the last 5 years. "You've built such a solid career of your own, Naomi," my mother said, holding both my hands the way she used to when I was small and had scraped a knee, her voice pitched low and warm, the exact tone she'd used my entire life to make an unreasonable request sound like a kindness. "You don't need the store the way Camille does. This is her whole life. It's time we made this official, don't you think, before things get complicated with all these new people involved?" I didn't answer right away. I looked past her toward the main room where I could see the projector still cycling through my father's old sketches, his handwriting steady and small in the corner of each page, notes to himself about shelf heights and morning light. And I thought about the folder sitting in my car in the parking lot outside, 311 pages, 5 years of bank statements and invoice discrepancies and forwarded emails, organized the way I organize everything, by date, by category, by the quiet, patient logic of someone who has learned that the truth doesn't need to be loud. It only needs to be complete. "I think we should talk about this properly," I said, "somewhere quieter than a party." My mother smiled, relieved, mistaking my calm for agreement. She had no idea yet how completely she'd misread the room. She had no idea that I hadn't come to that gala with an open mind about her proposal at all. I had come with an answer already decided, 5 years in the making, and a folder that was about to make sure the anniversary my mother had planned would be remembered for a very different reason than the one she'd intended. I want to tell you this story the way it actually unfolded for me, slowly, over 5 full years, because I think that's the only honest way to tell it. Nothing about what my mother and my sister did looked dramatic while it was happening. It looked, almost every single time, like ordinary family business. A salary here, a renovation there, a distribution quietly adjusted for now. That's exactly what made it so easy for them to keep doing and so hard for a long time for me to name out loud. I want you to understand before I take you back to the beginning that I am not a person who acts quickly or loudly or on instinct. I am a person who reads the whole ledger before I say a single word about what it shows. That's the only reason any of what follows was possible at all. If you're new here, welcome. And if you've ever been the family member everyone assumed would just quietly go along with things because you'd always gone along with things before, I think this is going to be a familiar shape to you. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from tonight, and if patient, documented justice is your kind of story, stay with me because this one took 5 full years to build and every one of them mattered. Let me take you back to where all of this actually started, long before any trust or any store, to a house on Whitaker Street in Savannah where I grew up as the older of 2 daughters, 4 years ahead of my sister Camille, in a household where the emotional temperature had a way of shifting depending entirely on which of us was in the room. I want to describe that house a little because I think it matters to understand the setting this all grew out of. It was a modest 2-story clapboard place, the kind that needed constant small repairs my father was always halfway through fixing, with a kitchen table where most of the family's real decisions actually got made, long before any of them ever reached a trust document or a lawyer's office. I learned to read a room at that table before I learned much of anything else, which questions were safe to ask, which silences meant it was better to simply help clear the dishes instead. I don't think I understood as a child that I was learning a survival skill. I thought I was just being helpful. My father, Walter, was a steady, unshowy man who built Astor and Vine out of a small inheritance from his own father and a genuine, uncomplicated love of well-made things. My mother, Vivian, was the more visible half of their marriage, warm in public, quick to laugh, the kind of woman other mothers at school functions gravitated toward. And Camille, from almost the moment she could talk, was what people in our extended family liked to call a lot of personality, which was usually said with an indulgent smile rather than any real concern, the way you'd describe weather rather than a person. I want to give you 3 specific memories from that childhood because I think they explain the shape of everything that came decades later far better than any general description could. The first, I was 11, Camille was 7, and our father had brought home the very first hand-thrown vases for what would eventually become the store's opening inventory, laid out across our dining room table for inspection. Camille, delighted by the colors, picked one up too quickly and it slipped from her hands and cracked against the table edge. My mother's first instinct, instant and unthinking, was to turn to me. "Naomi, why weren't you watching her?" I remember standing there, 11 years old, absorbing the idea without anyone ever saying it outright, that Camille's mistakes were simply weather that happened around her, while mine, including, apparently, the mistake of not preventing hers, were mine to own. The second, at 16, I started keeping the books for my father's single struggling shop after school, an unpaid arrangement that began because I was good at math and genuinely enjoyed the quiet, orderly satisfaction of a ledger that balanced. I did that for 2 full years, through my junior and senior year of high school, learning inventory systems and vendor terms that would eventually become my actual career. Camille, at 12, was enrolled that same year in a children's theater program my mother described, at every family dinner for months, as where Camille's real gift is. Nobody ever suggested I had a real gift too. I don't think it occurred to anyone, including me at the time, that quietly keeping a small business from going under at 16 years old might have counted as one. The third, The week I left for college, my father sat me down in his cramped back office at the store and told me with more emotion than he usually showed that he didn't know what he'd have done those 2 years without me, that I'd kept the numbers honest when he was too tired to see straight himself. It's one of the only times in my life my father ever said something like that to me directly, and I've held on to it carefully ever since because it turned out to matter more than either of us could have known at the time. That's the shape of my family going into everything that followed. Me as the reliable one, quietly making sure the machinery underneath the family kept running. Camille as the favorite, whose gifts were named out loud and celebrated. And my mother as the one who decided, usually without ever having to say it directly, which of those two roles mattered more in any given moment. There's a fourth memory worth including, because it shows how early this pattern calcified into something closer to a family constitution than an occasional favoritism. The summer I turned 17, our extended family gathered for my grandmother's 80th birthday, and my great-aunt Louise, a blunt, unsentimental woman nobody ever fully controlled, remarked out loud over dessert that it was a shame Naomi never got the same fuss made over her that Camille did. My mother laughed it off in the moment. Smooth as ever, Naomi doesn't need fuss, she's never wanted it. And I remember sitting there, 17 years old, feeling the particular sting of being complimented and dismissed in the exact same sentence. I didn't correct her. I'm not sure at 17 I even fully understood yet that there was anything to correct. I just absorbed it, the way I absorbed most things back then, and went back to helping clear the table. My father died in March, 5 years before that anniversary gala, of a heart attack in the stockroom of the flagship store, 63 years old, gone before the ambulance arrived. I want to move through the grief quickly here, not because it wasn't enormous, but because I think the story that matters is the one that started almost immediately afterward, while all three of us were still functioning on almost no sleep and a kind of numb, mechanical grief. His will, drawn up 4 years earlier by a Savannah estate attorney named Robert Calloway, was plain and specific. Astor and Vine, along with its associated reserve account, would be held in a family trust with my mother and me named as co-trustees, and ownership split evenly, 1/3 each, between my mother, my sister, and me. I remember reading that document at Calloway's office 3 weeks after the funeral and feeling something that surprised me at the time, not relief exactly, but a quiet, steadying sense that my father had seen me clearly right up until the end, in a way the rest of my family sometimes hadn't. That feeling lasted about 11 months. There's an incident from that very first year before the salary decision that I think matters as the true starting point, even though I didn't recognize it as one at the time. At the reading of the will itself in Robert Calloway's office, my mother asked almost offhandedly whether the co-trustee arrangement could be simplified so that she alone handled the day-to-day, with me consulted only for anything major. Calloway, to his credit, pushed back gently, reminding her that my father had specifically named both of us as co-trustees with equal signing authority, precisely so that no major decision could be made unilaterally. My mother let it go that day, gracious about it in the moment. I understand now that she simply filed the idea away for later, the same way she filed away most things she wanted but couldn't yet have, patiently, without complaint, waiting for a moment when asking again would meet less resistance. The first real incident came that January, 10 months after his death, when my mother proposed, reasonably enough on its surface, that Camille, who had recently left a marketing coordinator job she'd held for 3 years, take on a formal role as creative director for all 3 store locations at a salary of $58,000 a year, funded directly out of the trust's reserve account. I remember sitting at my mother's kitchen table when she brought it up, the same table where Camille had cracked that vase 30 years earlier, and hearing her say in the same warm, unassailable tone she'd used my whole life, "Your father would want us to keep this in the family, and Camille needs the stability right now. You understand that, don't you?" I did understand it, or told myself I did. My rationalization that first year was straightforward and I still believe genuinely reasonable at the time. Camille had real skills, the stores did need a stronger creative presence, and a family business quite literally exists to employ family. I signed off on the salary as co-trustee without much resistance. What I didn't yet understand was that this was the first of what would become, over the following 4 years, a long, patient, always individually defensible pattern of the trust's resources flowing toward Camille, while my own third of the business quietly, steadily shrank in every practical sense that mattered. By the second year, Camille's role had expanded into overseeing a full renovation of the flagship store, new shelving, updated signage. A complete redesign of the front window displays at a cost that came in, by the project's end that November, at $94,000. Nearly double the original $50,000 budget my mother had presented to me for approval as co-trustee. When I raised the overage gently at what was supposed to be a routine quarterly trust review that December, my mother's response arrived fast and smooth, the way it always did when Camille's judgment was in question. "Renovations always run over, Naomi, you know that. Camille has such a good eye, this is going to bring in real customers. You have to spend money to protect what your father built." I remember sitting there, doing the math in my head even as she spoke, understanding that $44,000 in overage, unbudgeted and largely unitemized in the receipts Camille eventually provided, represented nearly 4% of the entire trust's reserve, gone in a single project I'd approved at less than half that cost. I asked at that same meeting to see the itemized contractor invoices supporting the overage, and my mother told me Camille would put something together for the next quarterly review. It took 4 months and 2 more requests before I finally received a folder of receipts, several of them handwritten. One for $6,200 in design consulting that listed no vendor name at all, only Camille's own signature as approval. I remember flagging that particular receipt at the time, asking who specifically had provided $6,000 of design consulting with no invoice, no business name, nothing. My mother's answer was immediate. "That's just how creative work gets billed sometimes, Naomi. Not everything comes with a formal invoice." I let it go. I want to be honest that, looking back now, that $6,000 line item, unsupported and unquestioned, was probably the very first dollar that never actually left the family at all. I approved the final accounting anyway. I want to be honest about why, because I think it's the same reason I kept approving things for the next 3 years running. Challenging Camille's spending meant challenging my mother's judgment about Camille, and challenging my mother's judgment about Camille had never, in 42 years, gone anywhere good for me. It felt, every single time, like a smaller cost to simply absorb the overage than to have the argument. I didn't yet understand what that math would eventually add up to. There's a second incident from that same year worth including, smaller on its own, but part of the same widening pattern. That August, my mother adjusted the business liability insurance on all 3 store locations, dropping the flagship store's coverage limit from $500,000 to $275,000 in order to redirect the difference in premium savings, roughly $3,100 annually, toward what she described as marketing initiatives, which turned out. When I finally reviewed the itemized spending 18 months later, to consist almost entirely of a rebranding photo shoot featuring Camille as the face of the company, published in a regional lifestyle magazine that December. I didn't catch the insurance change at the time. It was buried in a routine renewal document I signed as co-trustee without reading every line as closely as I should have, trusting, the way I'd trusted for years, that my mother wouldn't do anything that actually put the business at risk. When I finally noticed the gap, reviewing old policy documents as part of building my case in year 4, I remember feeling something close to real alarm for the first time, not about the money specifically, but about what it told me regarding how little scrutiny my signature had actually been receiving by that point. I had been signing off on things, I realized, the way you sign a form you've stopped expecting to contain anything unusual. I don't want you to think those early years were only this. My husband, Dean, a structural engineer with an even, unflappable temperament, was the person who first suggested, quietly over dinner that same December, that I start keeping my own separate file of every trust-related document, every invoice, every distribution, every email, just so you have your own record, not because I think anything's wrong, just because it's smart. I remember feeling almost silly agreeing to it at the time, like I was being needlessly cautious about my own family. I started the file anyway, more out of professional habit than suspicion, in a plain accordion folder I kept in the bottom drawer of my home office desk. I had no idea yet how much that folder would eventually hold, or how much it would eventually matter. There was also my father's old employee, a longtime shop manager named Odell Marsh, who'd worked at the flagship store since 1997 and stayed on after my father's death out of what I genuinely believe was real loyalty rather than convenience. Odell would call me occasionally, not to complain exactly, but to mention small things in passing: a vendor invoice that seemed off, a delivery that never quite matched what got billed, the kind of quiet observations a person makes when they've spent 25 years learning exactly how a business is supposed to run. I started listening to those calls more carefully than I let on. By the third year, the trust's quarterly distributions, the actual cash payments each of the three of us was entitled to under my father's will, had started shrinking in a way that, on paper, always had an explanation. My third, which had been roughly $9,200 per quarter in the first year after my father's death, had fallen to $5,400 by that spring, a drop of nearly 40%, while Camille's combined salary and distribution had, over the same period, grown by almost 60% once you accounted for a car allowance my mother had approved for her that January, framed as necessary for store visits across the three locations. When I asked about the discrepancy directly at a trust meeting that June, my mother's explanation was calm and, as always, wrapped in language that made the imbalance sound like prudent business management rather than what it actually was. "The reserve needs rebuilding after the renovation, Naomi. We all have to tighten up for a while. It's not personal, it's just what the business needs right now." I remember looking across the table at Camille, who said nothing, studying her coffee cup with an expression I couldn't quite read, somewhere between discomfort and a very practiced kind of not noticing. I asked at that same meeting why the reserve rebuilding appeared to be happening asymmetrically, why my distribution had fallen nearly 40% while Camille's combined compensation had grown. My mother's answer, when it came, was the first time I remember her voice carrying even a trace of impatience with me. "Camille has a job here, Naomi. You have your accounting firm. It's not the same category of need." I sat with that phrase for a long time afterward. Category of need, turning it over the way I'd turn over any figure that didn't reconcile. It was the first time anyone in my family had said, plainly if not quite intentionally, that my third of my father's business was being treated not as an ownership stake at all, but as a discretionary line item, subject to review whenever someone else's need was judged to be greater. That's the machinery of it, and I want to name it clearly right here, because it's the single most important sentence in this entire story. Every individual explanation sounded reasonable in isolation: a renovation running over, a car allowance for a role that required travel, a reserve that needed rebuilding, and none of those explanations, taken one at a time, would have struck any outside observer as clear evidence of anything. It's only when you lay 5 years of those explanations end to end, in exact dollar figures, dated and cross-referenced, that the actual shape of it becomes impossible to miss. I understood that professionally better than almost anyone. I just hadn't yet let myself apply that understanding to my own family. There's one more incident from that same year I want to include, because it's the one that first made Odell start calling me directly instead of simply mentioning things in passing. That September, Camille married her longtime partner, Miguel Ruiz, in a ceremony held at the flagship store itself, closed to customers for 3 full days for setup and cleanup. The trust covered $22,000 of the wedding costs categorized in the books when I finally reviewed them, under flagship store special event marketing, a category that, as far as I could determine going back through 5 years of records, had never once been used before or since. I didn't know about the wedding expense at the time it happened. I found out 8 months later, buried in a line item during a review I was already conducting for other reasons. When I asked my mother about it directly, her explanation arrived with the same practiced warmth she brought to everything. "It generated wonderful publicity for the store, Naomi. Half of Savannah saw those photos. It wasn't really a wedding gift, it was smart marketing." I remember sitting with that explanation for a long moment, turning it over the way I turn over any number that doesn't quite balance, understanding that whatever technical truth it might have contained, it was also unmistakably $22,000 spent on my sister's wedding using money that belonged equally to all three of us, without ever once being framed to me as a request I could have said no to. If any of this sounds familiar, if you've ever watched a family's resources quietly redirect toward the person everyone always protected, one reasonable-sounding explanation at a time, I want to hear about it in the comments below. I read every one of them. And if you haven't hit subscribe yet, now is the moment. because what I found in year 4 is where this story stopped being merely unfair and started being something I could actually build a case around. In March of the 4th year, Odell called me on a Tuesday evening, sounding more hesitant than usual, and mentioned that a longtime pottery vendor, a small studio out of Asheville the store had worked with since 2003, had recently stopped delivering, replaced by a new supplier Camille had brought on that January, a company called Renfield Home Goods, based, according to its invoices, out of Atlanta. I want to describe what happened next carefully because it's the moment this stopped being a pattern I merely resented and became a pattern I could actually document. I ran a basic corporate record search on Renfield Home Goods that same week, the kind of search I do routinely in my professional work, and found that the company had been registered only 14 months earlier, in November of the 3rd year, with a single listed officer, Camille Ostrander Ruiz, my sister, using her married name, at a residential address that, when I cross-referenced it against the county property records, turned out to belong to my mother's second home on Tybee Island. Over the following 8 months, I traced $61,400 in trust-funded purchase orders that had flowed from Astor and Vine to Renfield Home Goods, a company my sister owned and operated herself quietly, without ever disclosing that ownership to me as co-trustee. Marking up inventory at rates I calculated, based on comparable wholesale pricing in the same category, at roughly 38% above what the previous Asheville vendor had charged for materials of a similar grade. I built that 8-month trace the same way I build any professional forensic case. Quietly, methodically, cross-referencing purchase orders against delivery receipts against bank statements, checking dates against Camille's own calendar, which she'd shared with the family years earlier and never thought to revoke access to. I found, for instance, that on 4 separate occasions, Renfield invoices were dated for deliveries that arrived, according to the flagship store's own receiving log, a full week before the invoice itself had even been generated. A small, telling inconsistency that told me professionally exactly what it usually tells me: paperwork being assembled after the fact to fit numbers someone had already decided on. I didn't confront anyone yet. I want to be honest about why, because I think it matters more than almost anything else in this story. I didn't yet have the full picture, and confronting my family with a partial case against people who had spent 5 years perfecting the art of explaining away every individual number would have accomplished nothing except warning them to cover their tracks more carefully. I had learned professionally that the worst thing you can do with an incomplete case is present it too early. So I did the only thing I actually knew how to do well. I kept building. There's one more incident from that same year I want to include, because it's the one that finally convinced me the pattern had moved beyond financial mismanagement into something closer to deliberate concealment. That October, the flagship store's assistant manager, a sharp, detail-oriented woman named Priya Desai, who'd flagged the Renfield pricing discrepancy to Odell months before he ever mentioned it to me, was let go abruptly with 2 weeks severance, in what Camille described to me as a restructuring decision, nothing personal. I later learned through Odell that Priya had raised the exact same pricing concern directly with Camille 3 separate times that summer in writing, before her termination. I reached out to Priya myself that November, carefully, explaining only that I was reviewing some vendor records as co-trustee. She was guarded at first, understandably, but eventually shared with me the 3 emails she'd sent Camille, each one more detailed than the last, each one unanswered except for a final, brief reply reading only: "Thanks for flagging, I'll look into it, appreciate your diligence." I sat with that email for a long time. It was, I realized, almost exactly the same kind of warm, dismissive, entirely noncommittal language my mother had used on me for years. I understood, reading it, that I wasn't the only person in this story who had been quietly, patiently absorbing something they shouldn't have had to. I had simply been the one with the most reason and the most patience to eventually do something about it. I want to pause here again because I don't want this story to read as purely bleak leading up to what came later. That same spring, my daughter Ruthie, 8 years old at the time, came home from a school project about family businesses and asked me, completely unprompted, to tell her everything about her grandfather's original store, the one on Bull Street she'd never gotten to see. I spent an entire Saturday afternoon showing her old photographs, the same hand-drawn sketches that would later be projected on that brick wall at the anniversary gala, and watching her genuine, uncomplicated delight in her grandfather's careful handwriting reminded me, more than almost anything else that year, exactly what I was actually trying to protect. Not money, not fairness in the abstract. The actual, specific thing my father had built with his own two hands for all three of us, and what it would mean to let it be quietly hollowed out before Ruthie ever grew old enough to understand what she'd lost. Odell, too, remained a steady presence through that stretch in his own quiet way. He'd stop me sometimes when I visited the flagship store just to talk about ordinary things: a new delivery, a customer who'd asked after my father by name, a repair the old stockroom door still needed. He never once asked me directly what I was doing with the information he passed along, and I never told him. But I remember, one afternoon that June, him saying almost offhandedly while restocking a shelf, "Your daddy always said the numbers don't lie, even when people do. I expect he'd be glad somebody around here still believes that." I didn't answer him directly. I just nodded and went back to my car and added one more folder to the growing stack in my trunk. By January of the 5th year, my mother informed me, almost in passing during a phone call about an unrelated matter, that she and Camille had begun preliminary conversations with a private equity group about a possible full sale of Astor and Vine. She framed it, as she framed everything, as an opportunity too good to pass up. A chance to finally give all three of us real security, she said, though by that point I'd already calculated, based on the shrinking distributions and the Renfield markups alone, that my actual third of the business on paper was worth substantially less than it should have been. Precisely because of 5 years of undisclosed redirection I now had extensive documentation of. I remember that phone call clearly. Standing in my kitchen with the dinner dishes half done, my mother's voice bright and rushed in the particular way it got whenever she was excited about something Camille had brought to her. She used the word "we" 6 times in under 2 minutes, describing decisions that had apparently already been discussed, weighed, and largely settled, weeks before I was told any of it was happening at all. I asked, as evenly as I could manage, when exactly these conversations had started. "Oh, just casually, a few weeks ago," she said, in a tone that made the timeline sound smaller and less deliberate than I already suspected it actually was. In February, I learned, again through Odell, who had become, without either of us ever formally acknowledging it, something close to an ally inside a company that no longer entirely trusted me with information, that the buyer, Aldous Whitfield's firm, had specifically requested a clean cap table ahead of closing, meaning a structure with as few active owners as possible. That request, it turned out, was the actual origin of the buyout offer my mother would eventually present to me at the anniversary gala 2 months later. Not a kindness, not even really a negotiation, but a preemptive solution to a problem the buyer had raised, quietly worked out between my mother and my sister weeks before I was ever told any of it was happening. I want to name something explicitly here because I think it's worth saying plainly, the way I'd say it to a client reviewing a forensic report: everything that had happened over the previous 4 years. The salary, the renovation overage, the shrinking distributions, the vendor markups had never really been separate incidents. It had all been building, patiently and consistently, toward exactly this moment. A version of Astor and Vine's ownership structure clean enough, and a version of me quiet enough, that removing my third of the business would look, on paper, like the obviously reasonable choice rather than what it actually was. In late February, 3 weeks before I found the spreadsheet that finally completed the picture, my mother asked me to sit in on a single due diligence call with Aldous Whitfield's team, framing it as a courtesy to keep me in the loop. I remember the call clearly, 40 minutes long. Mostly Camille walking through store performance metrics with a polish I hadn't quite expected from her, and one moment near the end when one of Whitfield's associates asked, almost as an afterthought, whether all 3 owners were fully aligned on moving forward with a sale. My mother answered before I could. "Completely aligned," she said, smooth and immediate. "We're finalizing some internal paperwork, but yes, completely aligned." I remember sitting there, saying nothing, technically true in the sense that I hadn't yet said no to anything, and understanding, even as the call continued, that my silence in that exact moment was being quietly logged on the other end of the line, as consent to a plan I hadn't actually agreed to at all. I didn't correct her on the call. I told myself at the time that it wasn't the right moment. I understand now that there was never going to be a right moment handed to me. I would eventually have to build one myself. The moment that finally completed the picture for me arrived on March 3rd, 6 weeks before the anniversary gala, almost by accident. My mother had asked me to help finalize the guest list for the event, sharing a shared spreadsheet through an email account she'd forgotten I still had edit access to from an earlier project. Scrolling past the guest list tab, I found a second tab labeled simply Transition that had clearly never been meant for my eyes. It was a timeline built out in careful bullet points, mapping the entire sequence of the buyout. The $180,000 offer figure calculated according to a note beside it at roughly what she'd accept without pushing back given her history. A target date for my signature set deliberately for the night of the gala itself, when she'll want to keep the peace in front of guests, and a final line near the bottom of the document that I have not been able to fully stop thinking about since. It read, "Naomi's the safe one to move first. She won't make a scene, she never has." I sat with that sentence for a long time in my home office, the accordion folder of 5 years of documentation sitting open on the desk beside me. Not the plan itself. By March of that 5th year, some quiet part of me had already half expected something like it. It was that specific phrase, "she won't make a scene, she never has," that stayed with me. 42 years of being the reliable one, distilled by my own mother into a single, calculated line item in a spreadsheet. A variable she'd already solved for because she'd been right about me for so long that she'd stopped considering the possibility she might, eventually, be wrong. I scrolled back through the rest of that transition tab more slowly the second time and found 2 more lines I'd skimmed past the first time through. One read under a column labeled Risk, simply Naomi Lowe, sentimental about legacy unlikely to escalate publicly. The other further down under a column for timeline notes, push signature before any external accounting review, cleaner before, not after. I remember reading that second line and understanding, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that the timing of the gala itself, the very night I'd later stand up during my mother's toast, had never been a coincidence. It had been chosen deliberately because a public celebration is the one setting where a person like me, sentimental about legacy and unlikely to escalate, could be most reliably counted on to stay quiet. I didn't call anyone that night. I didn't cry, which surprised me at the time, sitting there with the desk lamp humming faintly overhead. I felt something in me go very still and very clear instead, the particular stillness that comes right before you finally, completely stop giving someone the benefit of the doubt they've been quietly counting on you to keep extending. I closed the laptop. I opened the accordion folder instead for the first time in months and began methodically, the way I approach every real case in my professional life, to lay out 5 years of documentation in full. The salary approvals, the renovation invoices, the distribution records, the Renfield ownership filing, the markup calculations, and now at the very front a printed copy of that spreadsheet tab, time-stamped and saved before my access could be revoked. I called Dean first, sitting at my desk that same night, though he was only in the next room. I think some part of me needed the formality of actually calling him, the way you'd call a colleague about a case rather than simply raising your voice through a doorway. I read him the spreadsheet line and then I read him 5 years of numbers, out loud, in order, the way I'd eventually need to read them to someone else entirely. Dean was quiet for a long moment after I finished. Then he said something I've turned over many times since. "Naomi, I've watched you build a career on exactly this skill, following a pattern nobody else could see yet, laying it out so plainly that eventually nobody can argue with it. I think some part of you already built this case knowing eventually you'd have to use it. I don't think the question anymore is whether what happened is real. I think the question is whether you're finally ready to let it stop happening quietly." That sentence landed harder than almost anything else anyone said to me that whole spring, because he was right, and I think I'd known he was right for longer than I'd let myself admit. I had been building this file for 4 years, technically, ever since Dean first suggested it at that kitchen table, and some part of me had always understood, even if I hadn't said it out loud, that a person doesn't keep 5 years of meticulously organized financial documentation on their own family unless some part of them is quietly preparing for the day they'll finally need it. I also called an old colleague that week, a forensic accountant named Priscilla Nkemdirim, who had trained alongside years earlier and who now ran her own consultancy specializing in family business disputes. We met for coffee and I brought the entire folder, laying it out for her the way I'd laid it out for Dean, in full chronological order. She went quiet for a long time, flipping through page after page before finally looking up at me. "Naomi," she said, I want to be very direct with you because I think you already know this professionally, even if you haven't let yourself apply it personally. This isn't a family disagreement about fairness anymore. This is a documented 5-year pattern of a co-trustee breaching her fiduciary duty, combined with an undisclosed related party transaction through your sister's shell company, all of it building toward a transaction specifically structured to remove you from ownership before that pattern could ever be discovered. If a client walked into my office with this exact file about a business partner rather than a mother, I would tell them without hesitation that they are sitting on one of the strongest cases I've reviewed in years. I remember asking her, almost sheepishly, whether it mattered that none of it had technically been one single dramatic act of theft, that everything, taken individually, could still be explained away as a series of reasonable business decisions, the way my mother had explained each one away for 5 years running. Priscilla shook her head. Intent is easier to prove with a pattern than with a single incident, not harder. Isolated decisions can be coincidence. 5 years of decisions that all flow in exactly one direction, culminating in a spreadsheet describing you as the safe one to move first, that's not coincidence, Naomi. That's a plan, and now it's a documented one. I want to be honest about the fear underneath all of this, because I think it's the real emotional center of the whole story, more than any invoice or spreadsheet tab. It wasn't primarily fear of losing money, though the money mattered enormously: $61,400 in vendor markups, tens of thousands more in shrunken distributions, and now a proposed buyout at less than half of what I was actually owed. It was a smaller, older fear, the one I finally let myself say out loud, sitting across from Priscilla in that coffee shop. If I stop being the daughter who quietly absorbs whatever the family needs absorbed, who am I to them? Who have I ever actually been to my mother, if not the safe one, the one who doesn't make a scene? I thought about the vase Camille broke when I was 11, and the reflexive question my mother had asked me instead of her. Why weren't you watching her? And I understood, sitting there 31 years later with a folder of financial evidence on the table between us, that the entire architecture of my role in this family had been built on exactly that same foundation. I was the one responsible for outcomes. Camille was the one responsible for nothing because someone else always would quietly absorb whatever she left behind. My mother hadn't invented that pattern out of nowhere. She'd simply built on it year after year because it had never once failed to work. There was a specific evening that week, about 10 days before the gala, when I sat alone in Ruthie's room after she'd fallen asleep, watching her breathe in the particular stillness only a sleeping child has, and I thought about what it would actually mean long term. To let this go the way I'd let so many smaller versions of it go over the years, to sign the $180,000 buyout, keep the peace, absorb the loss quietly the way I'd absorbed everything else, and let Ruthie eventually grow up believing that this was simply what a family did with the people in it who didn't make trouble. I decided, sitting there in the dark, that I did not want that particular inheritance passed down to her, however much smaller and gentler that decision might have felt in the moment than actually doing something about it. I want to walk through the 2 weeks that followed in some detail, because I think the emotional weight of this story lives less in the confrontation itself than in the long, quiet work of actually deciding to have it. I met with an estate and trust attorney, a careful, unhurried man named Franklin Cole, who reviewed the entire file over the course of 3 separate meetings, cross-referencing every figure against the original trust document my father had signed 5 years earlier. I remember the first of those 3 meetings especially clearly because it was the first time I'd said the whole story out loud, start to finish, to someone with no personal stake in how it landed. Franklin listened without interrupting for nearly 40 minutes, taking notes in a small, precise hand not unlike my father's, and when I finished he set his pen down and said, "Mrs. Ostrander, I want to ask you something before we talk about strategy. How long have you known on some level that this was happening?" I sat with that question longer than I expected to before answering. "Honestly," I said, "probably since the renovation began in year 2. I think I've known for 3 years, I just hadn't let myself call it what it was." He nodded, unsurprised, the way I imagine he'd nodded at 100 other clients who'd said some version of the same thing. "That's more common than you'd think," he said. Recognizing a pattern and being ready to act on it are two very different moments, and there's nothing wrong with needing the distance between them. He confirmed, in plain terms, what Priscilla had already told me. As co-trustee, my mother had a clear fiduciary obligation to disclose related party transactions, an obligation she had, by any reasonable legal standard, repeatedly and knowingly violated. I had, he told me, more than sufficient grounds to petition for her removal as trustee, to demand a full accounting and restitution of misappropriated funds, and should I choose to pursue it, to block the sale to Aldous Whitfield's firm entirely until the ownership dispute was properly resolved. I didn't want to block the sale. I want to be honest about that because I think it matters. I had spent 5 years watching my father's business get quietly hollowed out from the inside, and some part of me understood that a clean, well-negotiated sale, structured fairly across all three of us, could actually be the right outcome, just not one negotiated in secret, on numbers that erased 4 years of documented harm, timed deliberately for a night I wouldn't want to make a scene. What I wanted, and what I spent that final week deciding how to actually get, was simpler than restitution and larger than money. I wanted the pattern seen plainly by the people who mattered, not just my mother and Camille, who already knew exactly what they'd done, but by the family, friends, the vendors, the 2 local journalists who'd been invited to write a warm, celebratory piece about 25 years of Astor and Vine's legacy. I wanted the actual story told once, completely, in a room where it couldn't be quietly explained away afterward the way every individual piece of it had been explained away for 5 years running. I want to say something more here about the particular texture of that 2-week stretch, because I don't think deciding to confront my family fully captures what it actually felt like to live inside. There were mornings I woke up entirely certain, the decision settled and calm in my chest the way a completed audit feels, every number checked, every source verified, nothing left to second guess. And there were other mornings, usually after a night of too little sleep, when the whole plan felt suddenly reckless, disproportionate. Like I was preparing to detonate something that could never be fully rebuilt afterward over what might, in some alternate version of events, have eventually resolved itself quietly if I'd simply waited a little longer, the way I'd waited for 5 years already. Dean was patient with both versions of me that whole stretch, in a way I've never fully thanked him for properly. He didn't try to talk me out of the doubt on the hard mornings, and he didn't try to inflate my confidence on the easy ones. He just kept asking the same steady question again and again whenever I spiraled. What does the file actually say, Naomi, not what you're afraid it means? What does it say? And every single time, going back to the numbers themselves, the exact figures, dated and sourced, impossible to argue with on their own plain terms, settled me faster than any reassurance he could have offered instead. I also spent part of that week thinking, more than I expected to, about my father. I don't believe in signs particularly, and I don't think this story needs one to land. But I found myself, more than once that week, sitting in my car outside the flagship store after hours, looking at the darkened front window where his original hand-lettered sign, Astor and Vine, ESD 1994, still hung, restored twice over the years but never once replaced. I thought about what he'd said to me the week I left for college about keeping the numbers honest when he was too tired to see straight. I understood, sitting there, that the numbers had never stopped needing someone to keep them honest. It had simply become, somewhere along the way, entirely my job alone, and nobody had ever formally asked me to take it on. I had just quietly kept doing it, the way I'd quietly kept doing most things in that family for 5 years, until the day I finally decided that quietly wasn't going to be enough anymore. Franklin helped me draft 2 documents that final week: a formal notice of breach of fiduciary duty, ready to be filed with the county probate court the following Monday regardless of what happened at the gala, and a shorter, plainer summary, 4 pages instead of 311, organized specifically to be read aloud, clearly and without technical jargon, to people who had no forensic accounting background at all. I rehearsed reading that summary out loud, alone in my car, twice that final week, timing myself, making sure every sentence landed the way I needed it to land: calm, factual, undeniable. I decided one more thing that week, sitting with Dean at our kitchen table the night before the gala. I would not confront my mother and Camille privately in the quiet back-office conversation my mother had clearly planned and expected. I would wait until the toast, The moment my mother herself had built into the evening's program, the moment she'd choreographed specifically to celebrate 25 years of a legacy she was, at that very same event, quietly trying to take a third of away from me. I decided I would let her have her toast, and then I would ask for the room. The main room at Astor and Vine's flagship store held all 41 guests comfortably by 8:20 that evening, gathered loosely around the small raised platform where my mother stood, champagne glass in hand, ready to deliver the toast she'd been planning for months. I stood near the back, close to the projector cart, the 4-page summary folded in my clutch, the full 311-page file still sitting in my car, ready if it was needed, though I already suspected, standing there watching my mother's practiced, warm smile catch the light that it would not be. I remember the specific feeling of standing there in those last few minutes before she began. Not nerves exactly, though there was some of that too, but something closer to the particular stillness I get right before presenting a completed forensic report to a client. The sense of having already done the actual hard work, weeks and months of it, and simply needing now to say it out loud clearly, in order, without letting anyone else's reaction pull me off the sequence I'd built. I glanced once toward the back of the room where I'd left my car keys with the valet, the 311 pages locked in my trunk, a reminder to myself that I had more than enough behind me if the room needed more than 4 pages to understand what I was about to say. My mother's toast ran nearly 6 minutes, warm and genuinely moving in places. She spoke about my father's hands, about the smell of the original shop's back room, about 25 years of a family that had, in her words, always taken care of each other. I watched several guests around me actually tear up. I want to be honest that some small part of me did too, listening to her describe a version of our family history that was true in almost every detail except the one that mattered most. When she finished, raising her glass for the room to join her, I raised my hand instead, stepping forward before the applause had fully settled. "Before we drink to that," I said, keeping my voice level, pitched exactly loud enough to reach the back of the room without straining, "I'd like to add something to the legacy you just described, if that's all right." My mother's smile faltered just slightly, the particular flicker of someone recalculating in real time. "Naomi, now really isn't." "It'll only take a few minutes," I said, "and I think, given what tonight actually is, it belongs here." I opened the 4-page summary and began reading, plainly, without embellishment, the way I'd rehearsed twice alone in my car that week. I read the salary approval from year 1 and the renovation coverage from year 2 and the distribution figures from year 3, watching, as I moved through each one, the room's collective attention shifted from polite confusion toward something closer to genuine stillness. I read the Renfield Home Goods filing next. My sister's name, my mother's Tybee Island address, the $61,400 in trust-funded purchase orders routed through a company Camille had never once disclosed her ownership of as legally required to me as co-trustee. I watched Camille's face go pale, watched her look toward our mother rather than toward me, the way she'd looked toward her for guidance her entire life. "You always made things so complicated, Naomi," Camille said, her voice climbing, brittle in a way I'd genuinely never heard from her before. "It's a family business. We were trying to build something. You've never once understood what it actually takes to build something." "I understand exactly what it takes," I said, and I did not raise my voice to meet hers. "I kept the books for this business for 2 years before either of us could legally drive Camille. What I don't understand is why building something requires routing $61,000 through a shell company registered at Mom's beach house without telling me." I turned back to the room, to the 2 journalists standing near the back with notebooks that had gone, I noticed, entirely still. A woman near the front, whom I recognized as one of the store's longtime pottery vendors, asked quietly, almost gently, "Naomi, does this mean the store's actually in trouble?" I shook my head. "No, the store is fine. The store has always been fine. What hasn't been fine is how the money moving through it has been divided among the 3 people my father actually left it to." I could see, watching her face, the question settle into something closer to understanding. And I noticed around the room several other guests exchanging the same quiet, recalibrating glances, not shock exactly, but the specific expression of people realizing a story they'd taken for granted had another chapter they'd never been told. I want to be clear that I'm not here tonight to end this business, or to end this family, whatever anyone decides to make of what I've just said. I'm here because for 5 years, every time I raised a question about where our father's money was actually going, I was told it was for the good of the family. I want everyone in this room tonight to understand what the good of the family has actually meant, in exact dollar figures, for the last 5 years running. I found the line I'd rehearsed hardest, the one I'd wanted to get exactly right, and delivered it last, looking not at Camille but at my mother. You can't spend 5 years quietly deciding whose sacrifices count and whose don't, and then ask the one who never got counted to sign the paperwork making it official. I waited 5 years to say that clearly in a room where it couldn't be explained away again. It was worth every one of those days. Nobody clapped. It wasn't that kind of room and it wasn't that kind of moment. But I watched Aldous Whitfield, standing near the bar with his own untouched glass, quietly set it down and step toward the door, and I understood, watching him go, that whatever version of a clean cap table my mother had been building toward for months had just irreversibly stopped being clean. I want to give my mother one moment of real honesty here, because I don't think it's fair to leave her out of this story as a flat villain, even after everything. Standing there in front of a room gone quiet, she didn't reach for anger the way Camille had. She looked instead for just a moment before she composed herself again, genuinely stricken, an expression I recognized underneath everything as real. "I never thought of it as taking from you," she said quietly, more to herself than to the room. "I thought of it as protecting Camille. I don't think I ever once asked myself what that meant I was doing to you. I don't excuse what she did. But I believe, standing there, that some part of her meant that, and some part of me, even that night, still wanted to believe it too." I remember, in the seconds after she said it, feeling the whole room hold its breath slightly, waiting to see whether I would soften, whether the evening would tip toward reconciliation right there on the spot, the way these moments sometimes do in the stories people tell about families. I didn't soften, not completely, though I felt the pull of it, 20 years of being the daughter who made things easier, right there in my chest, asking me to let this be the moment I made it easy one more time. I didn't. I simply said, quietly enough that only she and Camille could really hear it, "I believe you didn't think of it that way. I think that's part of the problem." Then I stepped back from the small platform, folded the 4 pages closed, and let the room do whatever it was going to do with what I'd just given it. Nothing about what followed was resolved cleanly, and I want to be honest about that, because I think stories like this one do people a disservice when they tie everything into too neat a bow. Within 3 weeks, working with Franklin, we reached a formal settlement rather than a court battle, though the filed notice of breach remained ready the entire time as leverage neither side ever needed to fully use. My mother agreed to a full accounting of the trust's 5 years of activity, restitution of $61,400 for the Renfield markups, and a revised distribution structure, retroactive for 1 year, that finally reflected the even split my father had actually written into his will. The sale to Aldous Whitfield's firm eventually did go through, 4 months later, at a renegotiated price of $2.1 million, lower than the original offer, once the buyer's own attorneys reviewed the newly disclosed history, but split, this time genuinely evenly among the 3 of us, exactly as my father had intended 5 years earlier. The negotiation itself took the better part of that spring, longer and more exhausting than I'd expected, even after everything Franklin had prepared me for. There were 2 separate mediation sessions, held in a conference room at Franklin's office, where Camille's own newly retained attorney pushed back hard on the Renfield restitution figure, arguing the markup calculation was overstated. Priscilla, brought in as an expert witness for that specific session, walked through her own independent verification of the numbers, line by line, until Camille's attorney quietly stopped pushing. I remember sitting across that table from my sister, both of us represented by lawyers now, addressing each other by full name, and thinking how strange it was that it had taken exactly this, formal, structured, entirely unsentimental, to finally get an honest accounting of 5 years that had never once been honest while it was happening. I stopped by the flagship store that same week before the sale closed, mostly to see Odell one more time before the new ownership brought in its own staff. He was restocking the same shelves he'd been restocking for nearly 30 years, and when he saw me, he set down the box he was holding and just looked at me for a moment. "Heard some of it through the grapevine," he said. "Didn't need the details. Figured your daddy's numbers finally got read the way they were supposed to be read." I told him he'd been right about more of it than he probably realized, and thanked him properly for the small observations he'd passed along over the years without ever once making them feel like an accusation. He waved that off the way he waved off most compliments. "Just keep my eyes open," he said. "Your daddy taught me that too." Priya Desai, the assistant manager Camille had let go, reached out to me herself that same month, having heard through Odell that the accounting had finally been corrected. She didn't ask for anything. She just wanted to know whether her original concerns had been part of what finally moved things forward. I told her they had been more than she probably knew, and she was quiet on the phone for a moment before saying simply, "Good. I wondered if anyone ever actually read those emails." I told her I had, eventually, every single one, and that they'd mattered. Camille and I are not what we once were. I want to say that plainly because I don't think this story should pretend otherwise. We exchange holiday messages now, brief and careful, and she has, on 2 occasions since that night, asked to meet for coffee, both times canceling within a day of the scheduled meeting. I don't know whether we'll ever fully repair what happened, or whether the version of our relationship that existed before that gala was ever quite as solid as I'd spent 30 years assuming it was. I've made a kind of peace with not knowing yet. I did see her once more that summer briefly at Ruthie's cousin's graduation party, a large enough gathering that we could both attend without it being strange. We spoke for maybe 5 minutes, mostly about nothing, the weather, a mutual cousin's new job, and near the end, as she was leaving, she said, quietly, not quite looking at me, "I never actually thought of you as someone I was taking from Naomi. I think I just thought of you as someone who'd always be fine either way." I didn't have a response ready for that. I just nodded and told her to drive safely and watched her walk to her car, understanding that the sentence she'd just said, however unintentionally, was probably the most accurate description anyone in my family had ever given me of the role I'd occupied inside it for over 40 years. My mother surprised me. About 2 months after the settlement, she asked to meet me alone at the original Bull Street location, now closed and mostly empty, waiting for its final walkthrough before the new ownership took over. She didn't apologize in any grand, cinematic way. She simply said, standing in the empty space where my father's first shop had been, "I spent so many years making sure Camille never had to struggle that I forgot to notice you never once asked me to make things easier for you. I think I mistook that for you not needing it." I don't think that was ever true. It wasn't a full repair. It was, I think, the most honest thing my mother has said to me in years, and I've chosen to let that be enough for now without pretending it undoes everything that came before it. We stood there a while longer in the empty shop, both of us quiet, and she asked, eventually, whether I remembered the vase Camille had broken all those years ago at our dining room table. I told her I did, more clearly than she probably expected. "I've thought about that afternoon more than you'd think these last few months," she said. "I asked you why you weren't watching her. You were 11. I never once in 31 years asked myself why I thought that was your job to begin with. I didn't say anything to that right away. I just stood beside her in the space where my father had built the first version of everything and let the silence hold what neither of us quite had the words to finish saying out loud. The part that means the most to me, honestly, out of everything, isn't anything that happened between the adults in this story at all. It's Ruthie. 2 weeks after the settlement, she found the accordion folder still sitting on my desk, curious the way 9-year-olds are curious about anything that looks important, and asked what it was. I gave her a version she could understand, that it was proof I'd kept patiently over a long time to make sure something that belonged to our family stayed fair. She thought about that for a moment and then said, with the plain, uncomplicated logic children sometimes manage better than adults, "So if something's not fair, you don't have to yell, you just have to write it all down." I told her that was exactly right. She's asked me a few times since, small offhand questions that tell me the lesson is settling somewhere real in her, whether she should keep a folder about a disagreement with a friend at school, whether writing something down counts as proof. I've tried to answer those questions carefully. Not wanting to teach her that every disagreement in life requires a case file, but wanting her to understand, in whatever small, age-appropriate way she can, that patience and documentation are not the same thing as silence, and that noticing a pattern clearly is not the same thing as making trouble. I think of everything that happened over those 5 years, that's the single piece of it I'd fight to protect all over again. I keep coming back to something Priscilla said to me in that coffee shop before any of this had fully resolved. 5 years of decisions that all flow in exactly one direction isn't a coincidence. That's a plan, and now it's a documented one. That's not quite the line I'd want you to carry out of this with you, though. The one I'd actually want you to remember is the one I said in that room, under my father's own hand-drawn sketches projected on the brick behind me. You can't spend years quietly deciding whose sacrifices count and whose don't, and then ask the one who never got counted to sign the paperwork making it official. Patience isn't the same thing as consent. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do with an injustice isn't to react to it right away. It's to wait calmly and completely until you can lay the whole truth down at once in a room where it can no longer be quietly explained away. I think about that difference often now, the difference between waiting because you're afraid and waiting because you're building something that will hold. For most of those 5 years, I honestly couldn't have told you which one I was doing. It's only from the other side of that gala night that I can see clearly it was always the second one, even in the years it felt indistinguishable from the first. If there's one thing I'd want anyone watching this to take away, beyond the specifics of my own family's numbers, it's that the difference between those two kinds of waiting isn't always visible from the inside. Sometimes you only find out which one you were doing once you finally open the folder in front of the people who assumed you never would. If this one landed for you, I'd love to hear your version of it down in the comments. The thing you waited to say, the folder you quietly kept, the moment you finally chose to stop absorbing what should never have been yours to carry alone. Share this with someone who's still keeping their own quiet record, and if you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe because there are a lot more stories like this one still to come. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight. I'll see you in the next one.